So the word Shakti literally means power, or it means energy. And in a particular way, say in an Indian philosophical tradition, in a tantric tradition, in a tradition of looking at the relationship between all the things that are in the world, Shakti is like the energy that's a kind of feminine principle. It doesn't mean it's associated with women, but it's about movement and life and energy. And Yoni is a word in Sanskrit that means the source. So the source is also like the homecoming. It's a place of power. And so Yoni Shakti is literally the power of the source, or the source power. It's like the power of life itself, or life herself. And in a female body, the yoni is, the Sanskrit word describes the female genitalia, but in a kind of very general sense. So it doesn't specifically relate to just the womb or just the labia, or it's the sense of the place of that female power in the pelvis. So when I talk about Yoni Shakti, I think about source power. We can also translate the word yoni with the English word cunt, which upsets some people because that word has become a bit of an insult. But in fact, literally speaking, because yoni is a general term, and so is cunt, they don't specifically relate to the vagina or to the cervix or to the labia, or they actually talk about the whole area. So it actually is a really good direct and literal translation, but it upsets some people because yoni sounds kind of esoteric and fine and dignified, whereas cunt in English can upset a lot of people, unless you happen to know that the etymology of the word cunt is related to kindness and gekindle, to kindle young, and it's also, really importantly, related to our inner knowing. So it means the word we have for cunning, and cuneiform, the first kind of writing that there was, is related to that same original word cunt. And so when I put them together, I see that cunt power is actually about the deep power of the source, and that source might be the power of the source of life, but it could also be the power of your deep intuitive knowing. So I take a kind of, in some ways it's quite a literal translation. You know, I'm interested in etymology. I studied Old English. I'm kind of interested in reclaiming that word. But Yoni Shakti is a very powerful Sanskrit term that talks about the deep power and energy of life, which is a feminine principle. It doesn't mean that men don't have it, but it means that it moves in a feminine way. It's actually that kind of power. When we think about the word siddhi in yoga, a siddhi is literally like a supernatural power. So in the Yoga Sutra and in quite a lot of writings about yoga, there's the description of how a yogi, a practitioner of yoga, would achieve siddhis. It's the sort of thing that you can imagine a bit like a sort of stereotypical yogi. You would actually engage in really strong penance or powerful disciplined practice, like sitting cross-legged at the top of the mountain for thousands of years and standing on one leg, or, you know, raising one hand above your head, or doing some kind of mortification of the flesh, some kind of disciplined practice that would get power over life force, and then you would get some incredible siddhi, like a supernatural power to be everywhere at once, or to be really tiny, or to have all the women in the world fall in love with you, or to be invisible. And there's all these amazing superpowers, magical powers are listed in the Yoga Sutras and in other places. And that's the general feel, is that if you work hard with your yoga practice, or perhaps if you do a lot of worship to a particular god, it's like you'll get a boon. And either you'll be granted some kind of great siddhi, or you will earn it, you know, by your diligent, disciplined, focused effort. And you won't give up until you get power over the life force, and then you can kind of do what you like with it. So that's the model. And when I was writing Yoni Shakti, the story, I was really struggling with this aspect of what yoga was about, because a lot of the writing I was doing around women's power was about letting power flow through you. So if you think of Shakti as this free form, free moving, powerful energy of life, you don't want to get in the way of that, you know. It's like you don't want to stop the waves coming in when the tides come in. They're going to do that anyway. So I was trying to create in my practice a way of being with power that would honor natural rhythms. For example, things like menstruation, instead of like taking power over that and doing practices that would stop your menstruation, or somehow allow you to continue as if you weren't menstruating. It's a very kind of masculine model. That's the Siddhi model. It's like get power over it, get in control, and then everything kind of does what you say. And to me, that didn't feel very appropriate for women's bodies, because women's bodies have a tendency to do things unpredictably. They get pregnant, they grow large, their breasts droop, they have extraordinary orgasmic experiences, they bleed, they leak, they make milk, they do. And I was like, all of this stuff, they go through extraordinary menopauses, that's more fluids, like masses of sweating and hot sweats. And it's like, actually, I was looking at the female body and seeing how could this yoga model of like getting power over something actually ever match a body where like power was naturally flowing through you at every point in your life. From when you get your first period, when you're a little girl, nobody has to like make the power of that come. You it just happens, So it's the same thing with menopause. You don't have to make that happen. It's just going to arrive. So these two things are going to happen to all women. Most women who are born in female bodies are going to get these things happening. So I was thinking about it, and I had a really wonderful student in Bristol where I was teaching a women's yoga class on a Wednesday morning, and she was called Ali Woosley, and she was a midwife. And I was writing Yoni Shakti and working with this particularly wonderful group of women every morning on a Wednesday. I mean, who shows up for a yoga class on a Wednesday? But they were always there. And one morning, we'd always do yoga nidra, and we were connected with the goddesses. And she sat up one morning, this amazing lady who'd seen thousands of births, watch amazing women like giving birth in the most extraordinary conditions. She just looked at me and she said, Uma, have you ever thought that, and she's also a great yogi, she's a yogini, she's been practicing yoga for years. And she said, Uma, have you ever thought that that whole yoga thing, the whole yoga technology, the whole of all of the lineages and the disciplines and all that is all about men trying to get a tiny little bit of a taste of the incredible power that just like moves through a woman's body when she's giving birth? And she just said this after a yoga nidra, and I just looked at her and I went, you are right. That's what I've been, she kind of clarified something I've been working with for a long time. And that's just one siddhi, like the siddhi of giving birth. So I started to see there were these female siddhis, and they weren't about power over. You didn't have to sit at the top of a mountain and meditate very hard to get your first period or to have your baby or whatever. You actually, power would move through you. So the female siddhis began to emerge like a constellation of initiatory moments in a female body. And I started to count them all up and look at what was happening. And that's what I set out as this set of female siddhis, which annoyed quite a lot of people. People were like, no, a siddhi requires disciplined effort, and these are just purely biological functions. And in fact, I even had a debate with a fairly internationally well-known, tantra and yoga teacher. And I was asking about the siddhi of menstruation. Because I knew from my experience and from doing lots of women's work, it was like we had two tracks going. We had all this women's empowerment work, and then we had menstruality consciousness and red tents, and then I had all the yoga work. And actually, often the people going down the women's empowerment routes were getting further and further away from yoga, because the essential basis of understanding the yoga didn't make any sense. As they were understanding the power in their own body, they didn't want to be showing up to classes where people were basically taking their power away from them and telling them what to do. They were like, I know my body and I know how it needs to move. At this point, I'm bleeding. At this point, I'm ovulating. At this point, I'm menopausal. I understand these powers in my body. And so as I saw there was two strands separated, and I actually felt that the female siddhis was a way to bring these things together. So what I did was to try and set out an understanding that a lot of women recognized. They went, oh, I know what you mean. And it was a recognition that we could see as not so much supernatural powers, but as powers that really intensely can move through our bodies, affecting us at every level of being. Physical, it's not just physical. And that was the argument I had with those teachers who said that. They said, oh, well, if people have, I said, what about menstruation as a power? You get visionary insight. If women really go into a deep bleeding place, you surrender to the power of life. You can get really powerful intuitive guidance. Your whole body is moved by this rhythmic power that's under the control of the moon, like the tides. And I would raise this as an issue, and these teachers would go, well, that's just a purely biological phenomenon. And they're kind of right if you're not conscious of it. So this was the link. If yoga was about bringing conscious awareness to stuff like your breath and your body and your moving, you could bring conscious awareness to your menstruation, your menarche, your menopause, to your sexual response, to things like lactation and pregnancy and birth. And those naturally arising biological phenomenon, physiological phenomenon, if you're conscious of them, you get conscious of their kind of cosmic imports at the highest level. And so I saw that those particular experiences were like a set of connections into cosmic power that just moves through your body. And so I identified them, and I said there was the menarche one, which is like when this power comes into the girl with her first bleed, which is still celebrated in some parts of the world. And also during the menstrual cycle, there are different ways of connecting with power, and that's also a siddhi. And then there's the siddhi of pregnancy that might happen to some women, which is an extraordinary thing, and birth. And then I identified that things like postnatal recovery, lactation, that female sexual response, which is an extraordinary awakening. And if you bring conscious attention to those things, and then menopause is a biggie, and that's going to happen to all women, whether or not they've done some of the others. So I could talk about it a long time, but basically I felt that if we brought conscious awareness, like we do in yoga meditation, to the natural rhythmic initiations into power of the female body, we would be onto something immensely empowering, that women wouldn't feel they have to deny these things, because a lot of yoga was about like being like a guy, pretending that you weren't menstruating, or finding a way to stop your menstruation, or carrying on regardless. And the same with menopause. They weren't very kind to women's experience. So I felt like if we turned it all upside down and looked at it another way, we could see that in fact these physiological experiences could be, if we brought conscious attention to them, they would be a gateway to massive empowerment, initiations into power. And I see it in women's lives, like girls who've had a really positive welcome into their womanhood kind of grow into this immense power. These young teenage girls who aren't ashamed of their menstruation, or pretending like it doesn't happen, or get put straight on the pill to eradicate it. If they're taught to really nourish and love and understand the cycles, they gain a kind of confidence. I've seen it with young girls that I've been fortunate to be around. And the same with menopause. Women who come through that with a consciousness that this is a challenge and it's the power of life moving through you, and all of that, actually they grow into a really conscious, empowered version of themselves. Same with pregnancy, same with women who are like consciously connected to their sexual energies. All of that is that, For men, like to be living with women or connected to their sisters, then you get it too. Yeah. I know men who are like, they go through pregnancy. There's like 17 pregnant women out there, and all their partners are going through that with them. Yeah. Or like I see it with my husband and my daughter. When she got into her womanhood, he kind of grew into a different kind of a father. And and obviously in the sexual response, that's like one of the places where we can meet. And I just think that's amazing. But if women don't do it for themselves, we can't, it's like we have a plug-in direct to the earth, because we're open. So we can connect, you're connected to the heavens. So it's like that. It's an amazing thing. But if the men don't let the women do that, we can't do that for you, do you know what I mean? It's like we're in it together. I believe there is a really intimate link between women's health and ecology, between personal well-being and planetary well-being. And that link in some ways is quite philosophical, but it's also really practical, and it has an impact on daily life, and it's also immensely political. So I quite like to explain a little bit about the cosmic philosophical idea, is that in yoga we understand that all the elements that the whole cosmos is made of, we are also made of that. We are not disconnected. So you can map in yoga energies, and in the esoteric anatomy of yoga, you can map the earth onto the lower body, from the soles of the feet to the pelvic floor, the water in the pelvis, the fire in the belly, air in the chest and through to the fingertips, and space above and where. So you can map the body. It's called the tattva yantra, which is like the geometric design of the human body as a manifestation of all of the elements in the cosmos, so that we're one and the same as everything else. So if you take that philosophical idea and then you map that into the reality of living in a human female body, and you see that what I observe is really, I don't know if the word epidemic is technically the correct word, but I see a huge number of specifically female challenges and ailments that are related to the care of the human body, the female body. And at one level, it's kind of cosmetic, to do with deforesting the body, the way that we've deforested the earth. So like, you remove all hair, you remove all any signs that would show that you're actually a sexually mature female human. Means no armpit hair and all that. So that becomes a little bit of a feminist issue in some ways, but if that's the forest of the body and we're deforesting it all the time, that's an interesting issue, but that's purely cosmetic, but it's also quite punitive. It's a kind of policing of the female body. And I often speak about the politics of the female body as being the first colonized territory in the world, in that a lot of the names that are given to pieces of human anatomy, female human anatomy, are named after men. Like we've got fallopian tubes, and like Dr. Fallopius didn't have any fallopian tubes. He happened to find them in a dead body of a woman, so he called them fallopian tubes after him. Then we've got like Bartholin's glands and the pouch of Douglas, and all our intimate geography is named after men's names, which is kind of slightly weird. So we can rename those things, and we can think about the relationship between what we need to do to our body and how we can sustainably live in the world, so that actually, at some level, the care that we take of our own bodily fluids, and the care that we take for the earth, and the care that we take for our rhythms and cycles can map on to a kind of ecological consciousness. So I see that every female body has in its cycles of menstruation, for example, the opportunity for us to make a gift back to the earth or to turn our blood into a toxic biohazard. So out of the shame that a lot of women have been encouraged to feel, in fact, it's very difficult to feel anything apart from shame. You have to work quite hard to feel proud about menstruating. And that what happens is that because we're so couched about with shame, women don't want to show, they don't want to let on. And so there's been a lot of products that have been developed with that shameful energy. It's like you want to hide everything. You don't even want to touch yourself. So we'll create plastic tampon applicators and plastic lined panty pads and all of this kind of thing. And these things are really huge toxic biohazards. The oceans are full of them. And one of the biggest choices we can make for women who are menstruating is the choice of reusable menstrual pads and cups, so that we can gift the blood back to the earth. If you put blood onto your roses and in your plants and your trees, they will grow beautifully. You can at least dispose of it without wrapping it all up in plastic and having to burn it, and it turns into a toxic biohazard, is my favourite term when we're talking about these things. So it's like we've got the blood of life and we've actually created something very poisonous out of it. So it's like the choices that women who are privileged enough to be able to make choices about our menstrual products can make makes a huge environmental difference. The environmental impact of sanitary protection is huge. And then on the other hand, there are women in the world who can't afford anything at all, who can't go to school, who can't go out of their houses. So there's a kind of huge imbalance globally amongst like Western women who perhaps have got a lot of money to make choices about these things and who choose plastic panty liners and things that are very polluting. And then people in places with very little money who have no choice at all. And it's as if we can work together. There's some amazing projects. There's a project in Auroville in India making reusable menstrual pads and supporting, as they're bought by the Western women who can afford to buy these products, they're gifting them to women who can't afford them. There's a wonderful campaign called City to Sea, who are campaigning for plastic-free periods. So to try and encourage women who have got the privilege of making choice. And I'm fully aware I have privilege to make choices about this. So I feel part of my job is to educate people that it makes a difference to the ecology of the planet what you choose to do about the ecology of your own body. And if you're shamefully wrapping up everything in plastic and sticking it in a bin, where is that going to go? Think about it, ladies. It's going to end up in landfill. And it doesn't need to, and it pollutes the earth. Whereas if we offer the blood stress, soak the pads, put the water back in the earth, offer things to grow. Or if you're living in a city, put it in your pot plants, grow stuff, or at least just let it be flushed so it's then back in with the water rather than in the landfill. So these things are important at the level of, I feel that shame and choices that are made around things like feminine hygiene products, even that term is kind of troubling, like as if it's not hygienic to bleed the blood of life. I mean, it's a weird term. That those choices, I think, aren't helpful for the ecology of our yonis, you know? So plastic lined stuff is actually really uncomfortable and unhelpful. It encourages bacteria to grow. It encourages all kinds of yeast infections. They're just not healthy. And at some deeper level, although obviously I don't know of any studies proving this. I just feel that a lot of the really harmful attitudes, some of the pornographic attitudes towards women's bodies and how they're objectified and infantilized, actually cannot be healthy at a psychic level for us to grow into women who might enjoy our bodies. There's a whole epidemic of self-harm amongst teenage girls. There's a massive growth in labiaplasty, cosmetic surgery that alters the shape of labia, because porn stars all have this kind of surgery, and so young girls don't actually ever see what a real woman looks like. They see these hairless, bleached, surgically altered vulvas. The ecology of the female body is being constantly presented as something that's synthetic and unreal and man-made. And so that isn't healthy, I feel. So quite what we do about all that in some ways can feel a little bit overwhelming, but what I choose to do about it is to educate people about making conscious choices on reusable, sustainable, environmentally friendly menstrual products. Reusable is best. And also giving women opportunities to feel comfortable in the bodies that they have without feeling that they've got to compare them with some surgically altered version of it, which is also, deeply harmful at the level of our capacity to be friendly to ourselves. These things are very violent surgeries, and there's a lot of, we can talk about like hair removal and things as being like the thin end of the wedge, but as that becomes more and more prevalent, then actually the prevalence of cosmetic surgery to alter our intimate places, our places of power, what is that about? And then at another level, there's just so much to be said about it. So I just want to make conscious choices for girls to feel positive around being women and the bodies that they have, not feeling they need to alter them. That's quite a lot.
I can do this. I can chop and.
Yeah, I mean, I can.
This is kind of part of the reason I'm making the documentary.
Yeah.
Is the Dalai Lama said about the Western woman saving the world.
Yeah, that is what he said. Apparently, you got to find the source of that, but I'm sure
it was at a conference. I can't remember which one, but
you've got the source.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I remember an Osho quote.
Yeah, I saw that.
About it's the feminine in all that's going to save the world.
Oh yeah, there's some good stuff on feminine leadership. I mean, the people who are working on feminine leadership are on that same thing. It's like we tried it another way. Can we try it this way now?
Yeah. But then I didn't know whether maybe Osho was actually saying that in a way to maintain the patriarchy. To say that like it's the divine feminine in all, he's including men.
Oh, I see.
I don't.
Well, no, I actually think there were some good things about Osho, and I'd like to take that as a positive thing. I don't know. I never studied with him.
If you want to...
I could talk a little bit about that, try and be a bit brief, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then. Yeah. Okay. So, considering the need for change in the world and rebalancing in terms of politics and ecology and finding a sustainable way to live on our planet, it seems to me that the current methods of leadership are not serving us very well. And that in order for there to be major political, ecological change and social change and justice, basically, that we need to rebalance things. So right now, the way that the most governments are working and most leadership positions are held are to do with a kind of patriarchal structure, like an upward pointing triangle with one guy at the top. It's the image of the emperor in charge, and everybody else is basically in chains. That's how patriarchy works. Like everyone is enslaved. Even the person at the top is enslaved because it's a miserable way to be. Yeah. So we only have to look at the suffering of our current leaders to know that they're not making wise decisions and they don't seem very happy. So the sense of rebalancing and women saving the world, or the deep feminine saving the world, is almost like a reversal of this for some time, so that we can actually, instead of privileging existing systems of power, which are abusive and which are being exposed all the time, all those systems in yoga, the hierarchies and lineages that are based on that kind of patriarchal structure with one man at the top, are being exposed one after the other in Tibetan Buddhism, in yoga practice of all kind, in ashrams, in cults, And what I see is that kind of masculine leadership has had its day. It's been exposed as not serving anybody very well, and that what's called for is feminine leadership. And that feminine leadership is something that women can model in the way that we understand about living in our own bodies, going with cycles, cyclical wisdom, respect, and honour for life. And that if we model that, council leadership, circular connections, networks rather than hierarchies, that's a form of feminine leadership, which evidently men can be involved in that too. But I think women have a special role through our circles and through our methods of working in that kind of connected way to show that energy can move in different ways. And it doesn't have to be competitive and cutthroat and that kind of capitalist patriarchy it's not serving the planet. It's exploiting and raping all the resources of the planet in the way that women have been exploited and raped in those systems under, in wars and in political strife and everything. So I would see that this is a positive way. And I think when people like the Dalai Lama are quoted as saying that Western women will save the world, it's this form of feminine leadership that is offering another way that's about justice and fairness and reparation and respect for life. When we look at the development of modern yoga, contemporary yoga, and we look at is that okay? I can hear the noise outside in the kitchen. I have to start again. I could hear loads of rustling. All right, so when we look at the development of the history of yoga, and we look at contemporary yoga practice, and we look at what we're able to know insofar as we can know about medieval yoga practice or practices before there were even written records, although that's a difficult thing to investigate in any scholarly way, what I see is that one of the key changes that has arisen is yoga has moved from its roots into a contemporary multi-million-dollar business, is that one of the things that's changed has been that mostly the original form of yoga will be a one-to-one tuition setup, be one teacher, one student. And now what we've got is a standard idea that basically yoga is taught in groups. I mean, I'm a yoga therapist, so I do work one-to-one with people, and there are a lot of people who do that, but we're a tiny minority. And generally speaking, that's considered to be a standard yogic thing. And it never was. It's a very recent phenomena. And the other very recent phenomena is that yoga was always something that it was men that were doing. All the medieval manuals are all written for men, by men, about men. Women do not appear in them, except for a couple of mentions where they're described as polluting forces that you need to keep very far away from, or that you need in order to do some kind of sexual practices. But now what we've got is a complete change around. So beforehand it was all men, and now it's practically all women. I mean, it's not all women, but it's a lot of women. It's a mostly female process, and mostly female students are in the classes. And I have a sense that if we could look further back, that in fact, the fact that there's this plethora of women now is in fact an insight into the original inspiration for yoga. And I would say that actually the great power that moves through women's bodies at the time of birth, through female orgasm, through the powers of menstruation and menarche and menopause are so awe-inspiring that I like to believe that actually it was those powers that inspired the men to create technologies to harness life force. Men needed to harness life force because the women had the life force like literally pouring out of them, the blood and the birth and the babies and the milk and the hot sweats and all of that stuff, witnessing female orgasm from a man's point of view, looking at that. I don't know what that's like, but it must be pretty awesome because it's a whole thing, so there's these immense powers moving through women's bodies. And my sense was that maybe the origins of yoga were like an inspirational desire to say, well, if we can create a technology that can kind of get hold of that energy, we could really do something with it. Bingo, pranayama, asana, mudra, bandha, they're all about getting hold of the life force and moving around. They're awesome practices. I love all that hatha yoga stuff. It works. It's great. You're going to, really get a feel for the life force if you start doing things like controlling your breath, which is the life force. So that's that sense that there's this wonderful masculine approach to like, what can we do with the life force? Aha, we can fix it, we can get hold of it. And, the women are just letting it all kind of flow. And really what's quite beautiful is that maybe the reason women are so attracted to yoga is because it gets them back in touch with the life force in a way that actually living in female bodies under patriarchy tries to disconnect you. It's kind of a really weird set of paradoxes. So like that you could go really quite deep with, to do with the women wanting to do the yoga practice in order to be more masculine, strong, powerful and in charge, but actually discovering that what it does is bring you more in touch with the life force, which of course if you let a female body be very feminine is going to do quite naturally by itself. So it's kind of an interesting paradox. And it seems to me that's an opportunity for these things to meet in some very creative, powerful way, but that maybe that was the original inspiration for yoga. And it didn't have to just be women's bodies, but it could be like, the natural world. They were all out in the forests, those yogis, weren't they, looking at the rivers and the animals and the power of life. So who knows? The 10 wisdom goddesses. The 10 wisdom goddesses are, in Sanskrit, they're called the Dasha Mahavidyas. Dasha means 10. Maha is great. Vidya is knowledge or wisdom. And they're a set of 10 goddesses. They are assembled together in groups in the Puranas, which are like sort of spiritual folk tales and fairy tales of India. They're very popular in East India, in Bengal. And my sense with these 10 wisdom goddesses is that they have a particular cultural place, but they don't necessarily just belong or are only relevant to people living in East India, basically. They've got a very global impact. And you can track, when I was writing Yoni Shakti, these 10 wisdom goddesses were very present as a structure. They actually structure the book. And they almost assumed for me not this sense of a goddess that you would go and worship very holily, like she's outside of you, like a saint up on a wall, but actually that the quality of energies that each one of those shared is something that's present in everyone. It's like aspects of ourselves, the shadow part of ourselves, the part we want everyone to see, and they're all aspects of our own being. So those 10 wisdom goddesses have been interpreted in a lot of different ways. They were very popular. There were some like 10th century yogini temples and worship of the goddess and connections to these 10 wisdom goddesses, but also to others. So that's, you can track their roots in different forms, little mother groups. But this particular group I'd like to talk about because I've really sensed how helpful they are. I share about these with people all over the world who've never heard of Shakti or the Mahavidyas, who've never been to India, who don't have any cultural connection at all with Hinduism, and they stand outside of that. I think they speak to all women. I'm mostly showing the women, and the big one that many people have heard of is Kali. So Kali is almost like the gravitational center of those 10 wisdom goddesses. She's time itself. So she's the principle of time and sharing and time passing. And she helps us understand about change. And she's also very fierce. She's a fierce goddess who's really interested in freeing us from ego connection. And you can group her in different ways. And what I've done is looked at how maybe each initiatory life stage in a woman's life has a guardian. I kind of asked these goddesses very respectfully, because I do believe them to be powerful entities. I asked them to stand as guardians for different stages of life. So many people would disagree with this particular presentation, and they'd say, no, it's about the evolution of consciousness, or no, it's about a particular form of complex tantric worship. But I've kind of taken them almost on face value as if they were like real badass, powerful women who actually were alive and were so amazing. They became legendary, like Boudica, or Cleopatra or something like that. So we really did live, but like they made an impact. Other people may disagree. So the way I worked it was that Kali was like this really powerful force at the center about the changing time and facing death and everything that arises in life. And that with her, if we tracked it back to the beginnings of a woman's life, that Shodasi, or Tripura Sundari, the beauty of the three worlds, would be like the 16-year-old. Shodasi actually means the 16-year-old. So she would stand as a guardian over the first menstrual period and the initiation into womanhood. and that Tara, who is usually placed in the north, you can set them in a medicine wheel. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I often work with them as a medicine wheel in different directions with Kali above. And Tara is in the north as a guiding star, and I asked her to be like the patron saint of the menstruality consciousness, so in all rhythms and powers that move through life. So that's Tara Devi. And Tara and Kali appear in lots of other places. Lots of people have heard of Tara and Kali, but not so, and also Tripura Sundari people have heard of, but not necessarily the other ones. So one of the other key Mahavidyas, I'm keeping track on my fingers so I can get to all 10 of them, is Bhuvaneshwari. So she's the goddess who is the beauty, she whose body is the world, basically. Bhu is the earth. And I've connected her with the powers of earthly connection to do with manifesting, to do with pregnancy, to do with motherhood, a kind of generosity. And also in the postnatal period, or in the period that kind of follows a near-death experience. Maybe Chinnamasta is powerful there. Chinnamasta is about the moment of change and the connection with that kind of change of really intense shift. So near-death experience and postnatal recovery or emigration. And also she's connected with that siddhi of lactation, of giving from yourself. She's a self-decapitating goddess, and from her energy we could move more into the energy around menopause. So Baglamukhi and Bhairavi are the goddesses I've asked to kind of stand with that energy of like the massive changes of menopause. And Baglamukhi is a really powerful entity who renders her assailant speechless. When you see pictures of her, she's actually holding his tongue. She gets this guy by the tongue and he drops all his weapons. So they're very powerful, those two are very powerful. And after Baglamukhi and Bhairavi, you get to Dhumavati, who's the grandmother. So there's this quality of everything we learn from suffering and old age and loneliness and poverty. So each one is a different aspect of life. And there's a couple that I think run through the whole of our life, which are the powers of creativity and sexual pleasure. And they're kind of represented in this scheme that I'm presenting by Matangi and by Kamalatmika. The lotus goddess of delight, everything we learn from pleasure, and Matangi is this wild outcast poet who speaks the truth and is that kind of very wild poet kind of character. So that's my summary of the 10 wisdom goddesses, and worshipping them can take the form of like welcoming in all aspects of yourself, all of these 10 aspects, the shadow as well as the light, what we learn from poverty and suffering and pain as much as what we learn from pleasure and delight, what we learn from our creative energies as much as what we learn from like just time itself moving through us. Yeah, that's the 10 wisdom goddesses. So there's a really big paradox right at the heart of modern yoga and all the modern yoga schools, because women especially, I think, come to yoga because they feel it gives them back their power and confidence in a physical sense, and they feel that the practices really make them feel good about themselves. That's why women like to do it. And at the same time, a lot of the structures, the hierarchies, the traditional patriarchal structures that teach yoga and train yoga teachers are in fact really abusive. They're abusive in the sense that they tend to disempower the people by claiming that one person has the authority and everybody else is simply learning from them. But also at a more sinister and really harmful level, a lot of young women and children, men too, but largely the cases that I know about have affected women, mostly young women, women who've been in environments where the guru is revered as a god, and therefore nobody will argue with them, and quite extensive sexual exploitation has arisen in ashrams, in yoga centres, in yoga schools, and the Me Too, the hashtag Me Too movement, that's like revealed abusers in many other fields of life have now really, it's come to yoga. It's yoga's turn, really. And not surprisingly, people were very reluctant to speak out, because if you're... women were very reluctant to speak out, because if you're in an institution like an ashram or a yoga school where you're getting the benefit of these practices and these teachings that make you feel wonderful and amazing, you don't really want to jeopardize that. You'd want to believe that what your teachers are telling you is true, even if you feel like maybe having sex with that older man who's evidently having sex with all of the students is perhaps not what you want to do. Then there's a lot of pressure for people to conform. It can be very hard to speak the truth in those environments because everybody's colluding with themselves and with each other and with the leaders of these organisations to make sure that their boat doesn't get rocked. And there's a whole complex set of intersecting oppressive hierarchies that makes it really difficult for people to speak out. But they are speaking out now. And it's not just about sexual abuse. It's about physical abuse that harms people. It's about training systems that train other people to go and harm other people. So if you brutalise people enough, then they will be quite happy to go and brutalise their students. So it kind of perpetuates suffering. And what I found when I was writing Yoni Shakti, which was happening like 2010, 2012, I was in the midst of receiving a lot of information about that. But that was a long time ago now, and it's simply escalated. And in a good way, many people have been working to help support people who want to speak out. And one of the most encouraging things that can happen is that we can actually support the victims, support the whistleblowers, support people who are speaking out about this so that we can actually move on, offer apologies and support and actually create other structures. Because so long as we have those structures like that, those hierarchical, patriarchal structures, they are systems of oppression. They are intersecting network of really oppressive hierarchies. They harm everybody in them. And there's no way to change that if you keep the structure the same. Unless we take those structures apart and expose what's gone on, keep the teachings, how can we do that without keeping those kind of really oppressive hierarchies that are very abusive? So that's the challenge. The challenge is to honour and listen to the truths of the people who've been harmed and abused, and actually to move forward, because we have a lot of treasure in the yoga world, and we need to really share it wisely so that it doesn't have to be tarnished or held in abusive structures that really injure people in every conceivable way. So I'm hopeful. It's a lot of hard work to say none of these structures work anymore, we don't want them, but there's some really impressive ways forward, I think, that can be helpful. So people coming out of those ashrams and coming out of those guru lineages and standing in their truth need our support. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And then I'll just record silence.